Since Cyclone Alfred has not yet hit Brisbane, I wanted to take the chance to get outside. It's currently a beautiful sunny day, believe it or not, and tell you a little bit about what it's like to do a robotics PhD in our lab currently, but also this would be representative of robotics or similar discipline PhDs in a lot of labs in the Australian PhD context. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the application process or getting shortlisted. This is going to be mainly about the actual PhD that you do. I have other videos on those other parts of the PhD process. So a typical PhD student is coming to us from one of two broad directions. Firstly, they may be already in Australia. There'd be what is called a domestic student. They may be coming to a PhD straight out of their undergraduate degree, or maybe they've done some work here or overseas and are coming back to Australia and back into academia to do a PhD with us. The second broad category of PhD would be an international student. So this is a student who's come from overseas, for example, India, and has come over to Australia and is doing a PhD with us. In Australia, the PhD program is relatively short. So compared to places like the United States, a lot of people are aiming to try and finish their PhD within 3 years, maybe 3.5 years. Now, it doesn't always work out that way, but 3 years is the nominal goal. And I've had some students who have gone underneath this threshold. So because the PhD is a little bit shorter than maybe what you're used to hearing about, for example, in the US system, it has some implications. The first is that the PhD program does not generally have a stack of extensive coursework in it. And so there are some basic courses that students will do on information finding, but you're not doing extensive bodies of coursework simply because there's not enough time. There are some other implications to the PhD process being so short. One is simply that because it is short, we are looking to find students who will be able to hit the ground running to some extent. So what that means is that in the interview process and the selection process, we'll have been talking to you in detail about your existing experience and your existing skill sets, and where possible, we will have built leveraging some of those existing skill sets into your PhD program, working collaboratively with you to flesh out the actual set of topics. The reason for this is simply so you can get more done and more done at an earlier stage of the PhD. Now, of course, the PhD will still be a huge opportunity for learning. We're not saying you're just going to use the skill set that you rock up with and learn nothing new, but starting completely fresh in a PhD in the Australian system, where it's only 3 years, say, can be tough. And so you'd have to pick up a lot of stuff very quickly. So where you do have existing relevant skill sets, we will leverage those as much as reasonable. The PhD process itself involves working closely initially, primarily with your supervisors. We always try and make sure that you have at least 2 actively involved supervisors. So you have a principal supervisor and you have an associate supervisor. And the idea is that academics today are quite busy. And so both supervisors are capable of stepping in and doing the supervisory role, and often both will be involved, but because you're traveling as a supervisor or maybe distracted by other things, sometimes only one will turn up. The PhD program itself has a number of formal milestones in the current system. There is an initial proposal that you sort of put a brief plan on what your topic is and what you'll do to get into the PhD in the first place and for your scholarships. But then about 3 months in, you'll do a more detailed plan detailing the structure of your proposed PhD and your research questions and how you're going to go about it, what resources you need and other details like that, as well as the background, what's already been done in the field. At 1 year, there is a significant formal milestone. You submit a large report and you do a 45, 50-minute technical presentation. And then the eventual milestones are a final presentation and the submission of your thesis document. Your thesis document submission can be in 2 different forms. It can be a thesis by publication, where you write from scratch an introduction chapter, a background chapter, but then you staple in your papers, so to speak. Basically, you're including published or in one chapter case, a submitted paper, as a chapter into your PhD and then writing a full discussion chapter. That would be a by publication PhD. You can also do the traditional monograph PhD where you write everything from scratch. So you're not directly pasting in any of your papers. Every single chapter is original. That thesis document will go out to external reviewers. When you do the final thesis presentation, you'll get some assessment and some feedback for how to improve that document before you send it off to those examiners or reviewers. And then after ideally 2 months, sometimes it takes a little bit longer than that, those examiners will come back with a recommendation, which can vary from your thesis is accepted to your thesis is not acceptable, or that's very rare. Most commonly, there'll be some required revisions. You do those, you resubmit it, it gets approved, hopefully, and then you have your PhD and you can graduate. So those are the core milestones. To expand a little bit more on what some of the critical milestones involve, so you will need to propose what you're going to do during your PhD, why it's important, and how you're going to go about it. Typically, this breaks down to some overarching research question, and then what you'll do below that is you would break out that overarching research question into typically 3 sub-questions. The reason for 3 sub-questions is that those 3 sub-questions line up very approximately with the 3 years of your PhD. And so each of those sub-questions would be addressing a sub-component of the overall research question. Sometimes they're quite sequential, so by doing the first research question, you can solve the second research question, but the questions don't always have to occur in exactly the order that you specified them. And in reality, as you get into the first question, you may realize that it needs some changes, you need to modify your approach, and that will have on-flow effects sometimes to the second and third question. You progressively and repeatedly state what this overarching question and what these 3 sub-questions are throughout the course of your PhD. You'll do it to some extent at a very high level at the application stage. You'll do it in much more detail at the 3-month stage into your PhD. And by the 1-year mark, you want to have a pretty firm idea of what those 3 sub-questions and the overarching research question is. So you're progressively getting more and more certain about what it is you'll do. When you specify what those 3 sub-questions are, usually the first question will be a question that you're already doing experimental research on and you already have some intuitive feel for how it's going to play out. And then the second question and the third question, which are going to happen later during your PhD, are obviously a little bit more speculative because you generally haven't got to the actual research that evaluates the viability of those ideas or the approaches and whether you're going to need to change some things. During the PhD, you'll have some sort of regular schedule, and this is especially important early on in the PhD. The first year of the PhD is very critical because that's going to really set the tone for the rest of your PhD. So typically you would set up something like weekly meetings with your supervisor, and these would continue as long as your supervisor is working. Sometimes they may need to be online if your supervisor is traveling, for example, for a conference, and sometimes if your supervisor is genuinely on leave or on holidays, you might have your meetings instead with your associate supervisor. And in the rare cases where both of your or all of your supervisors are away, before they went away, you'd make sure you'd structure a program of research for the time that they are away with a sort of if this, then that, if this, then that. So you're less likely to be sort of lost and waiting until they get back in order to find out what your new direction should be. I mentioned that the first year of the PhD is critical. Traditionally, the first year of the PhD, especially in the longer PhD programs, would have been entirely composed of just reading and thinking and background research. We like to get students into designing algorithms or methods or machine learning techniques or whatever it is, the technical area that they're working in, fairly quickly and do that in parallel with them reading deeply about the research field that they're working in. The idea is basically to get them on the tools, so to speak, get them familiar with the software packages, the data sets they're going to be working with, the robots, if applicable, that they're going to be working with as soon as possible. It also breaks up the monotony of just reading papers for full time every week, week in, week out, and gives you a variety of very different activities to do. The first year of the PhD is very critical, and during that time we would particularly encourage students to really focus on the PhD. But as the PhD goes on, and if it goes reasonably well, we would encourage students to branch out, to investigate potential collaboration opportunities with other people in the lab. One of the beautiful things about doing a PhD in a large research lab or center because there's lots of interesting people to talk to and lots of opportunities for collaboration. Students will also sometimes do part-time paid work during their PhD. A typical one would be running tutorials or practical sessions for a lecturer. Sometimes this would also be paid research part-time work as well. Generally, the rule of thumb there is that we don't want that work critically interfering with the progress of your PhD, and so we would encourage probably a little less of that in the first year of your PhD until you really get settled and get productive, and then that can potentially ramp up if your PhD is going well throughout the rest of your PhD. During the first year of a typical PhD, and of course there is no typical PhD, we would be working towards you submitting your first research paper based on the work in the first year of the PhD, typically associated with that first sub-question out of the 3 research questions that you're addressing. And ideally, you would submit a paper in maybe at the 8-month or 9-month mark to a conference or a journal to get that work potentially published. Now, of course, there is no typical PhD, so the timeline can vary hugely. Sometimes people don't get this first paper submitted until 1.5, sometimes 2 years into their PhD. It really does vary, but that would be the nominal aim. During your PhD, you will get the chance to hopefully go to at least one national or international conference where you have a first author paper typically accepted, and at that conference you get the chance to present your work, you get the chance to interact and see thousands of other pieces of research from the international community. The robotics community, for example, is quite large internationally, and the conference trips are really an amazing highlight of a typical PhD, budgets permitting. Some students will also do an internship or a research visit during their PhD, so this could be with a collaborating partner of your principal supervisor that has an overseas lab. You might go and work with them for 3 months, again, budget and logistics permitting, and usually depending on your PhD being progressing reasonably well. And again, especially for the domestic students who maybe haven't spent much time overseas, this is a really amazing, really eye-opening experience, a very enriching one to be exposed to a completely different culture, a completely different research environment, and a completely different country, sometimes for the first time. So that doesn't happen all of the time, but it does happen, and it can be a wonderful opportunity during your PhD. Back at home in your research group, especially if you're part of a large research group or a research center or institute, there are lots of opportunities for other types of professional related activities. In our center, for example, at the moment, we have a number of regular weekly activities that are run at a center level, various journal clubs and discussion groups, for example, that you can join in and participate in and maybe get a little bit of pizza. There are also other activities like training development activities. There may be work or research retreats as associated with the group that you join. And then there's the group of the professor or academic that you join, which will have its own local sort of subculture and set of customs. And you can become very engaged in those. You could even become a representative for the PhD students if that's something that really appeals to you. And in our center, again, people will run board games nights, philosophy nights, and these are especially important for the cohesiveness of the center, and especially important for students who've come from overseas and are sort of just gradually getting to know new people. The PhD almost never goes exactly as planned. A very typical example of this would be you do some great research, you submit your first research paper, and it gets rejected from the first conference, for example, that you submit it to. This is disappointing always. It can be quite confronting for students, especially the first time it happens, but it's not the end of the world. It happens to lots of people, pretty much everyone at some stage or another. At that point, it's very important to work with your supervisory team very closely. They'll have lots of experience. They'll work on a plan B with you, a way to improve the work, a way to resubmit it somewhere. And usually, or almost always, these things sort themselves out in the long run, but you will be leaning on the support and especially the experience of your supervisory team. I mentioned before that there will be opportunities for collaboration, especially if you join a large research group or a center. Again, in the first critical year of your PhD, we would probably try to limit how much collaboration that isn't necessarily related to your core area goes on. but as your PhD hopefully goes on and is successful, there'll be increasing opportunities for collaboration. Sometimes those collaborations will result in research that does form a part of your core PhD. Sometimes it will just be interesting research that you wanted to contribute to or are interested in that doesn't actually go into your PhD, but nonetheless enriches the experience of doing a PhD. Some of the typical ways in which PhD students contribute to other collaborative projects are if they bring a particular skill set. Maybe they're particularly good with a certain type of robotic platform. Maybe they're particularly good at the software engineering aspect of things. Maybe they have particular expertise in some specific robotics related capability, whether it's mapping or perception or navigation or uncertainty estimation, and those skills can be applied usefully to the topic of that other collaborative project. A lot of people ask about the work-life balance of a PhD student, and again, there is no typical answer to this, but what I can probably broadly say from lots of data points is that the overall workload that a PhD student carries on average is not necessarily any greater or a lot greater than what you would find in a professional job, but it is generally much more bursty or spiky. And so your PhD will naturally revolve around bodies of research and publication deadlines, and the lead up to these publication deadlines can be relatively hectic. They can be pretty intense and a little bit more stressful than normal. Conversely, the time after those publication deadlines are often a lot of fun because you've submitted something, you're very proud and happy with your achievements, and you can take a little bit of time off and sort of investigate some of those ideas that you've sort of paused while you're in the work up to that deadline. Some general, more philosophical observations on the PhD process. A PhD project is almost always smaller than what people imagine. The thing I always tell PhD applicants, especially ones who are coming straight out of undergrad to do a PhD, is that the PhD project will simultaneously be the biggest project that they've ever taken on, but also surprisingly small and focused and narrow compared to what maybe their expectations were initially. In the early stages of the PhD, where we're working with the PhD student to refine what their research question and sub-research questions will be, almost always that process involves heavy narrowing of the scope and really cutting down the ambition of the project to really focus narrowly on some specific areas of opportunity. And we can leave the more ambitious stuff in as stretch goals, but almost always you never actually get the chance to really get to those, and maybe that's what you would do in a postdoc. I also point out to students that when they get to their final stage, they've got their PhD and they look back at what they've achieved, they'll usually be very proud of what they've achieved, but they'll also be mildly dissatisfied because there was all these things that they wanted to investigate that they didn't get the chance to do. That is a very, very typical PhD process. There's nothing wrong with it, but it gives you an idea of the fact that it isn't this all-encompassing, life-defining project. It is a constrained body of work. You will learn a huge amount during your PhD. These will both be typically technical skills. So in our area, your mathematical, your coding skills, your communication and writing skills will go through the roof. They'll improve radically just by practice, by a lot of mentoring and professional development, and in the process of writing your papers and your thesis. All of those things will improve massively. But your soft skills will also typically improve. So you'll be working typically alongside fellow students, you'll be interacting with your supervisor, you may be collaborating later in your PhD with other researchers, sometimes from very different disciplines. You may even get the chance to work on industry projects, and many of our PhD students have spent some time working on applied research industry projects during their PhD. These will all teach you a lot of soft skills, time management, project management, stakeholder management, how to communicate with people, how to deal with stressful or problematic situations or professional relationships that are a little bit strained. All of these are soft skills that you get a lot of practice with during your PhD. So you come out the other end, both technically much more skilled and capable and knowledgeable, but also with a lot more of the soft skills that are required for just about any career. And these skills nowadays will benefit you whether you're doing a research career after your PhD or whether you're going into industry or startups. These skill sets will generally be useful for all of those different areas. That's it for this informal primer on what the PhD process is actually like once you get started in robotics in our lab and probably in many other Australian labs. I hope this gives you a bit of a feel for what it's like. I haven't covered all the details, as I said. I didn't cover much of the process before you start the PhD. I've covered that in some other videos, but hopefully this gives you a bit of a feel. The fear of the unknown is always a little bit challenging, and especially given the significant difference in how PhDs unfold in different countries and in different research systems. So hopefully after watching this video, you're a little bit more familiar with how it can run in our system. There is no typical PhD, of course, but I've hopefully given you a bit of a flavor for the types of PhDs and how they can unfold in our system.